to join us tonight can still benefit from all the great information. So hi everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Deanna White and I am the Minnesota State Director for Clean Water Action. We're really proud to host this panel this evening, as well as working with allies to make sure that as many people as possible get to see this great movie, The Story of Plastic. Clean Water Action is an organization that works in Minnesota and a number of other states on a variety of issues, including plastics. And we work to engage people, build power, and affect change to protect the water we drink and our health. And that's the goal of everything that we do. Before we get started, we do want to just take a moment and recognize and mourn the death of George Floyd, and recognize the pain and the chaos that's going on in Minneapolis and St. Paul right now, and in our communities all over the United States. This is a tragedy. His death is a tragedy. The way things have been handled with his death and with previous situations with the police here in Minneapolis and St. Paul is a tragedy. And our hearts go out to the family of George Floyd and all of the other victims of senseless violence. So we'll just take a moment and send our positive thoughts to those that are suffering tonight. We also just want to take a moment and recognize all the sacrifices that people are making to help protect our communities from COVID-19, and all of the actions of our first responders and our healthcare professionals and the folks that are keeping our communities strong as we go through this. And we want to thank all of you for being part of our community and being joining us tonight to be part of this discussion. Just a few logistics to get out of the way before I introduce our speakers. We have a couple of ways that you can ask questions this evening. One is you can type them into the group chat, and we'll read them off for the speakers. The other option is, if you'd like to ask your question yourself, you can go ahead and raise your hand, and our tech guy Tom will let me know to call on you, and he'll unmute you when it's time to ask your questions. And I just want to say a big thanks to Tom Johnson, who's our Healthy Legacy organizer, for taking care of all the logistics of pulling this event together. There's Tom, and handling all the behind the scenes tech tonight as we get through this event. This is our first virtual event this way, and so it'll be a learning experience for all of us. So hopefully you've all had a chance to see this amazing movie, and we are honored tonight to have the executive producer of the movie Story of Plastic with us, Stiv Wilson. And we also have Clean Water Action's legislative program coordinator, Jenna Grove, with us. And we're going to put their bios in the chat so that we can keep as much time open as possible for questions. So Tom, when he gets a second, we'll put Stiv's full bio and Jenna's full bio into the chat section, so you can go ahead and read them for yourself. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. We have asked each of the speakers to just take a few minutes and make some opening remarks. Then we're going to go to question and answer time. Then we'll give them a chance to give any closing remarks that they want to have. And we'll do our best to wrap up by 9 o'clock Central Time. I will also say that at the end of this, we are going to talk about ways that you can get involved, ways that you can help, and things that you can do to make a difference when it comes to addressing this crisis of plastic that we're all facing. So with that, who would like to go first, Jenna or Stiv? I think Tom, if you could unmute both of them, that would be great.
I mean, this is Stiv's labor of love, so I feel like it's only appropriate for him to give his remarks first. Great. No one's here to see me, let's be real.
Thanks, Jenna. Well, I'm duly inspired by your work as well. So it's really great to be here. I've worked with Clean Water Action in many states around the world, and worked with Jenna on some microbeads legislation in Minnesota a few years ago. It's how we got to know each other, and have continued to sort of scheme on toxics and plastics and all things that affect our air, soil, and water. So the story of plastic was a film that, you know, sort of came to me, honestly, about 10 years ago. At that time, I was working on plastic pollution issues, but mainly from an ocean perspective. I am a native Minnesotan. I grew up on 56th and Harriet in South Minneapolis. And so have been, you know, very, very addicted to what's happening there and mourning for the city of Minneapolis, St. Paul right now. So I appreciate you, Deanna, opening it with a moment of silence for Big George. So, you know, what this movie really means to me is there's a lot of underrepresented people in this world, a lot of marginalized communities. And I had spent about 5 years studying plastics in the ocean. I sailed 35,000 nautical miles around the world, sampling the ocean surface to do the first ever scientific paper on how much plastic was in the ocean. And it took us 4 years to complete that. And what didn't make it into the paper is the realization that by the time we finished the paper, we already knew that we were underestimating how much plastic there was. And, you know, I started asking a lot of questions at that point, and what are the root causes? Where's this coming from? So first that takes you to land and urban centers. Then that takes you around the world to places that do not have the same infrastructure that the United States does to deal with plastic waste. So to be very careful, I don't want to say they lack, I don't want to say they lack infrastructure. They just don't have the same infrastructure we have to deal with what is essentially a foreign material. And there was this moment in a landfill in Manila, Philippines, that I had visited called Smoky Mountain. It's called Smoky Mountain because it vents methane, which ultimately ignites from pressure underground. And there were these communities living in this landfill that would mine it for recyclables. Mostly metals, mostly nails, but they were growing food in the landfill, various types of lettuces and lemongrass and such. And as somebody who's really familiar with exposure pathways from toxics, like just looking at this was killing me. To see, you know, this incredibly industrious and resilient community without the access to the kind of information on what the exposures of toxics were to them. And, you know, we have this idea in Western culture about throwing things away. And so the number one question for me was, where was away? Where is this away we're talking about? Because it's not the bottom of your garbage can or recycling bin. It's where it ultimately ends up. And seeing that was sort of this moment that utterly changed how I viewed this issue. It went from mostly a sea turtle, dolphin, ocean biodiversity issue to a human rights issue. And it was the most profound experience of my life. And in particular, there was this moment when there was this man who lived in this landfill, and it's very hot in Manila, very hot. And it was midday, and most people sort of take a break when the sun's the highest. And he was in this sort of makeshift shelter, and there was a baby on his chest. And he looked at me as I was taking this photograph of him, and I felt as though I was exploiting. That, you know, I had this moment where I understood my own privilege in a way I never had before, and that this camera I was holding was worth more money than this man would ever make in his life. And at that moment, I vowed to make this film. And the film is about elevating voices that need to be heard. And not only because it's a matter of equity, but it's a matter of strategy. By bringing people who are affected all the way through the supply chain, because plastic pollutes from the second out of the ground to where it ends up, and don't necessarily know that people understood the whole system of plastic. So we wanted to tell the story of plastic from a systemic standpoint, but from the perspective of affected communities around the world. Because as you saw in the film, a lot of these communities understand the strategy, they have the expertise to manage and deal with this waste problem, but they're under-resourced and they're undervalued. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Institutional racism, global North elitism, unawareness of privilege. And so we felt if we're actually going to win on this, we need more voices at the table, and they need to speak from their own lived experience. And so that's what the story of plastic was. It took us about a year and a half to make, from shooting to editing. The budget for the film was $438,000. And so the one thing I can say is we never could have done this movie without tremendous buy-in from all the people you met in this film and their organizations. You know, we were able to land in a foreign city, we picked up, taken to the locations with the story, we had the people already like worked out. So we're eternally grateful to how much in-kind support we received to make this movie. And ultimately, we're really delighted with how many people are viewing it and the impact that it's having. Because our intention at the end is we as advocates and policymakers, if we don't understand the full story of plastic, it's really hard for us to enlist the right stakeholders and the right groups that need to be represented at the table, and also write the policy that speaks to the whole system. So our intention ultimately was to create a tool that the movement could use and give it away, frankly. Like we had no interest in making any money on it. Number one goal was we felt we had a succinct 90-minute tool that explained where plastic comes from and where it goes and who the people who are mostly affected by it. And we wanted groups like Clean Water Action here to use it to organize their communities to make change. So that's where it came from. Thanks.
Thanks, Stiv. Jenna, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, definitely. I've seen this documentary multiple times now, and it's always really interesting to hear Stiv talk about it afterwards, because what I really got out of it was the storytelling aspect. I feel like more often than not, some of these issues that require such systemic change are so robust to grasp that it's easy for folks to be misled, for people to get overwhelmed. And having that human connection and seeing that these industries who really exploited some unfortunate situations for profit, it's really disproportionately affecting those who are of lower income, of people of color. And each voice is very important. Each individual action is important, whether it's signing a pledge, making the choice to, not use plastic bags. Each of those individual actions are so meaningful, but as, we need to, as the status of the world modernizes, we need to evolve those individual actions. And I'm not saying, obviously, quit recycling or ease up on your commitment to environmental stewardship. I'm saying that we need to use those voices in a constructive way that gets at the top level problem. And that is, honestly, that industry has been able to craft and market and control how the narrative of single-use plastics, how the chemical industry is viewed in such a strong way that it's easy to get discouraged, anywhere from being misled straight out to almost kind of creating a culture of environmental superiority where it's either all or nothing. You're either an environmentalist or you're not. But the truth is that any little bit helps. And the more people who are willing to make even the slightest change and to talk about it and to share information and to not disseminate that fear of shame for not being a perfect environmentalist is so important. So important to crafting the narrative that is actually truthful. One thing I really learned working on plastics. So 2015, I believe Stiv mentioned the microbeads bill. Crazy, it seems like yesterday, but I had not realized how controlled some of these articles were. You could be reading an article without ever knowing it was written by the industry. If you just Google chemicals in plastics regulation, there are a couple like sponsored, you just click on it, it looks appealing. And the entire article was so forthright and so honest. And in conclusion, they said that the world's plastic problem is dire. That's true. The garbage patch in the ocean, that's real. Unfortunately, there aren't solutions to actually address it. So it's just like, they go through this article and they overwhelm you with how terrible it is and kind of like giving off that alarmist title they like to give anybody who cares about the planet. And then at the end, it's, well, this is all true, but there's no one simple fix. Well, there is, it's just not one they like because it would dismantle their industry as they know it. Beyond almost completely self-regulating for decades, to knowingly polluting our communities, to using chemicals that have no testing for human health effects. They've been able to get away with all of this without any admission of guilt, regardless of how many lawsuits there's been. And it's all because they have the money to implement these tactics and pay for all of these, for these incredible I mean, they're very effective. So it's really important that we share those individual stories and that we all are able to start repositioning how everyone sees the plastics industry, because it's not just people making a plastic bag. It's like Stiv said, as soon as it comes out of the earth, whether it's made from natural gas, whether it's fracked, the petroleum industry and the oil industry, plastics are one of the biggest arguments against them, but it's also the easiest controlled because obviously if you look at their more prevalent use, which is electricity, from an economic feasibility standpoint, that is dwindling. So their stranglehold on making people reliant on a product that is known to cause health effects, to degrade our environment, our water, I mean, it's opportunism at best.
Thanks, Jenna. So again, if you're just joining us, you have the chance to ask a question by either putting it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you and unmute you to allow you to ask your question directly. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in with the first question from the chat box from RS Family. Has COVID-19 exacerbated the plastic problem with the focus on takeout, disposable gloves and masks, not allowing reusable bags in stores, etc.? And are there any statistics on the impact? I don't know if either of you want to tackle that one.
I feel like we've had conversations about this together. So I don't know if there are any reliable statistics since there hasn't been a large enough sample, but I mean, going back to the marketing and the opportunism, they've certainly taken full advantage. They've tried to overturn bag bans, restrictions on polystyrene. I mean, those are just a couple examples, and I'm sure Stiv can give a more eloquent example because he's a lot closer to some of the, and I mean, that's another example is we've been so focused on single product bans and single chemical bans that, I mean, it's just busy work to them. keeping us distracted. So, I mean, this was an opportunity and they definitely took it.
Stiv, did you have anything you wanted to add? You're muted, just so you know. Okay.
Yeah, so there's some good news and some bad news here. One of the things that COVID has demonstrated is there's a great report by that was authored by this group called Center for International Environmental Law, and it's their latest report. If you look ciel.org/feeling plastics, they just published this report on the economic troubles the fossil fuel industry is in. And, you know, their argument is essentially, and Ciel was prominently featured in the film as well. Carol Moffat is the CEO of Ciel. Really great guy. But they looked at the economics of the fossil fuels, and for decades, the fossil fuel industry has been artificially propped up in the market. So both by subsidies, as well as capital infusion. So, for example, when a fracking well is drilled, it's really prolific for the first year, and then it runs at about 50% capacity the second year. The second year, that well is no longer profitable. So they have to keep drilling to keep moving those margins. And they have to keep borrowing money to build capital infrastructure. The good news is though the overall market is down, you know, on any given day, 20, 30%, oil and gas is down 80%. And several, Dow Chemical has paused 5 of their plants. They've stopped construction on new ethane crackers, which is how you turn ethane into ethylene, which is you then turn into polyethylene, polyethylene terephthalate, polypropylene, etc. All leans, as it were. And so they're hurting. And this is why they're asking for a massive bailout right now, is to, again, artificially prop them up. And at the same time, the current administration is starting to tax or beat up on renewables. And just in the last few days, renewables came under, that were operating on public lands. They had a rent freeze for a couple of years. And all of a sudden, the Trump administration said these bills are due now. And this is to artificially prop up the fossil fuel industry. The good news there is you can't actually prop this industry up. You know, there's a massive divestment campaign happening in climate. It's increasingly happening in plastics as related in solidarity with climate. So the overall amount of plastic post-COVID has being produced is going down. And yes, industry is sort of in a death throw and claiming the safety issue that surfaces are contaminated, so disposables need to be available and policies need to be rolled back. We don't see the plastic pollution issue as going away. And when you actually survey people, there's been some great research that's done. 60% of people who are polled are saying they're actually using less plastic. So optically, it may look like there's more in the space, but the reason the industry is pushing so hard behind the scenes is they're in serious financial trouble, like existential financial trouble. So, you know, one of the best things we can do is to hammer the nails in those coffins.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to go on to the next. I'm going to go on to the next question. Unless, did you need to add something, Jenna?
Yeah, I do want to agree with Stiv, but I want to add another component to that inflated economic status is just another example of how misleading they are, because their market price does not reflect the true cost. Public health costs, doctor visits, surgeries, diseases, death, environmental cleanup. I mean, the fossil fuel industry is notorious for creating a mess that costs millions and millions of dollars, and that's where they rely on those subsidies. So, I mean, yeah, they are absolutely in ruin. And even if you look at the other aspect, we've been footing the bill to poison our communities for way too long. It's definitely time to put the nail in the coffin.
So the next question comes from Danny Kramer. I work for an organization affiliated with Keep America Beautiful called the Allegheny Cleanways. I work with volunteers cleaning up illegal dump sites and litter. What can I tell volunteers when they feel overwhelmed and hopeless about the big picture problem? What's the best advice for first steps for people that want to make a real difference?
Yeah, I think this issue, I like to say that when you're overwhelmed, and you can't figure out how to solve a problem by yourself, that is a metal detector for showing there's a problem with the system. So we have a bad system, and we as individual people cannot change that system. Collectively, we can. So I think, the next step after cleanup is to, almost every city in the United States, even small towns at this point, has some sort of plastics advocacy, NGO volunteers. And, when we started doing this work 10, 15 years ago at this point, it was a really big uphill battle at that point, because people you want to ban plastic bags? Why? It's well, there's this patch in the middle of the ocean. People what are you talking about? Now it's become dinner time conversation. So first of all, that's a victory that people actually know that this is a problem, and people know about plastic pollution. So take that to heart. I think the next step is, I think cleanups are meant to build awareness and education, and give somebody a moment where they can make a change and they can see a metric effect. And that's ultimately satisfying. The next step after that is to organize with a group and exercise our civic rights. Because in any of these small towns or big cities, you can find like-minded people to start passing policies. And the more grassroots participation we have in local organizing, I don't even know, I'm not even sure how many chapters Clean Water Action has, but they cover definitely more than 50% of the states in the United States. They're actively working on plastic. So getting involved, showing up to hearings or ordinance, initiatives, and speaking from the perspective of your community. If kids testify, that's pure danger to a lawmaker or an industry person, because nobody wants to go against a kid. And so kids have a lot of power too. And so ultimately, I'd say the next step in feeling overwhelmed is channel that feeling of overwhelmness to anger towards who is responsible for it. And ultimately, is people producing it and are expecting us in our tax dollars to pay for all the externalizations or the true costs of plastic pollution, as it were. So it's all about a cycle of engagement, moving them from easy, whether that's signing a pledge or a petition, and moving them up the ladder of engagements. And for every 100 people that you inspire or educate, you'll get one leader out of that, somebody who will step in and organize. And it's exactly how I got involved. 15 years ago, I was on a beach in Oregon. I got upset about plastic on the beach. I Googled, I wrote a blog. I met a guy from Surfrider Foundation. I went to a chapter meeting, and that took me on a never-ending journey, and now I'm here. So, I'm just an ordinary guy. I made a movie, and it's a great movie, but I'm still just an ordinary guy, who exercised his will and his rights and civic duty to create change. And so everybody can do that, in my opinion.
Great. Jenna, did you want to add anything?
I mean, I wish I could, but I feel like that was pretty eloquent.
Fair enough. I have a feeling you'll want to take a swing at this next one. So the movie talks about how we will not get out of this mess until there are policies made that plastic producers hold plastic producers financially responsible for the impacts of the plastic industry. Does that sound right? And are there other policies that we should be advocating?
Oh God, we could be here for 3 days at this point. I mean, yeah, it is a lot easier to stop a environmental regulation from becoming law than it is to repeal one. And the industry has gotten really good at having relationships with the people that they have to make 1 to 2 points of contact to stop momentum on something that's going to potentially put a stop to the status quo, where despite their horrific track record, they've still been able to almost completely self-regulate. And in terms of the lawsuit, we've seen it for, oh my goodness, the last 50 years, where, you know, industry giants like DuPont and 3M can settle for hundreds of millions of dollars for discharging a chemical or illegally polluting the air without any admission of guilt. And then the argument at the legislature becomes how to spend that money, who has the oversight, what projects, where. So they really do a good job with distraction and a really good job with stopping and using the system that is broken to their benefit. And as Stiv mentioned, it is not an easy feat to change something so solid, like so steeled in the fabric of our society, whereas we need to prove that this regulation isn't going to be onerous to businesses. There aren't going to be job losses. But I mean, is that really factual? Probably not, because by not regulating and phasing out some of these toxic chemicals, these products, these things that are causing multi-million-dollar lawsuits that are just getting money thrown at them, really is a stifle to innovation and the opportunity to create jobs, designing and developing the next generation of consumer products that aren't going to cause cancer or developmental problems or horrific, legacy contaminants in our water and soil. That is as brief as I could probably be with that.
Stiv, did you have anything you wanted to add about policies that we should be advocating for?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of triggers that I think are really important. I think in the time of COVID, we really need to think about who's responsible for this. So Jenna touched on it earlier about, the costs of producing plastic or fracking or drilling for oil are externalized. They're not actually the true costs. So we as taxpayers are paying for air pollution, we're paying for waste, we're paying for cleanups, we're paying for public health problems. And so we need to start internalizing those costs. So anywhere where we can get industry to actually pay for the problems they're causing, in policy circles, this is called extended producer responsibility. We mentioned it in the film. I'm on a mission to rebrand extended producer responsibility because it's probably the worst marketing phrase on the planet. So, you can call it polluter pays, you can call it producer responsibility, but really that's it. We need to put the cost of the effect on our lives and our environment into the product. Another thing that's really important is we need to mandate recycled content in new products. Because virgin plastic is so much cheaper than recycled resins, it's not competitive. So if you look at the playing field for manufacturers to put X amount of recycled content in all new products, one, they're going to design for recyclability, They're going to make the products less complicated. They're going to use fewer polymers. So like, for example, a Capri Sun packet, technically you can recycle it. From an economic standpoint, you can't. There is no business model that makes that profitable because it's 3 different materials fused together, and to take part is very difficult. So one part designed better, designing for recyclability and creating a market for recycled content, making sure that producers pay for it at the end of life, and ultimately, pushing moratoriums and divestment schemes on moratoriums on new build out of chemical facilities and divestment schemes through the lens of plastic, not just climate. And these are university endowments, city endowments, pensions, all these sort of things. And at the same time, really problematic products just need to go. So polystyrene and which is styrofoam, polyvinyl chloride, which is PVC pipe, these are very dangerous materials, and we just shouldn't have them in commerce to begin with.
Great, thank you. I know we've had a few people join us, so if you'd like to ask a question, you're welcome to either type it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can ask your question directly. So I'm going to go ahead and take the next question, which is from Emily, who asks, what do you think the role of cities could be in solutions?
Oh, that makes me cringe because us Minnesotans know that during a particularly rough year for the environment at the legislature, that was something Governor Dayton gave up in negotiations, was to preempt local governments from banning plastic bags. So and there was no grandfathering in. So any bans that had been implemented previously were now null and void, and all of that work just demolished with the stroke of a pen, So there is definitely a significant role for local governments and municipalities and cities to play, especially when it comes to addressing the waste stream. But in terms of policy, here in Minnesota, it would be to, most we can do is pass a fee, and now Minneapolis does have a fee, but they've tried to preempt that the last couple of years too, so we'll see.
Stiv, anything about the role of cities?
Yeah, Jenna touched on, I think, one of the most vexing issues for us as advocates right now, which is preemption at the state level. This is a massive agenda of ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, because you tend to have more progressive and liberal cities that are interested in product stewardship bans or product bans. But at the state side, you can have a legislature that is more right-leaning or industry-leaning. And so, it's not fair. So nobody has yet to challenge preemption or figured out a way to do it. You can overturn it legislatively. You can start a ballot measure, which I think would be really successful, but it's very expensive. And then, you buy a lawsuit. No one's yet to do it. No one's yet to roll back preemption yet. But I think the role of cities is if, there's a law right now in Ohio that's being voted on preemption. And there's been a lot of work by Clevelanders to push that back, to try and keep preemption from going through. So, if your city governments are saying the state's looking at this, cities really need to get out, organize, and get to rural communities and say, this can't pass. So organizing, out of city, but by city folks can help as well. But it's a tough one.
Yeah,
great, thank you. Great. So we've got a hand up. Tom, if you want to unmute Kay, we've got a question from Kay Kessel.
I see, I'm unmuted. Stiv, I wanted to ask you, where did you go to high school?
I like that. I went to Minnehaha Academy, but I got kicked out, and then I finished at. That's a whole other story. I turned
Maybe
out
a
okay.
whole other movie.
Yeah, and I graduated from Holy Angels.
Oh, Holy Angels. Well, I wanted to say I'm retired from Washburn High School. I was assistant principal there, and Emily and I, 38 years ago, over at Barton School, we started the first recycling. Did you ever see that little truck over there by Barton School? Well, that was Emily Moore's invention, and our kids, that I bet my son or daughter are about the same age as you, and they helped, but then they kicked us out because other people went in and broke the glass and so on. But there's a climate strike group, you know, in all the high schools now for climate change. And I think we need to have your film in the schools, because that's where these young people are very motivated. And so I was wondering, is there a plan for that?
The reason you're able to watch it today is Clean Water Action went to storyofplastic.org, and you have to fill out a very basic form. But then one of our intentions as the filmmakers with this film was to ensure that there was wide scale use by communities, and that it was as easy as possible for them to be able to access the film. So you have to fill out a short form, and then you will get a download link to, or a viewing link that you can distribute throughout a school, you can show it in a school when classes come back together. But any community group, and you don't even need to be a nonprofit, like a faith-based group can do it, a school can do it. All you have to do is register, and you will then be able to show the film as widely as you like.
That's
for free, by the way.
That's a great question, Kay, and we'll see what we can do to get that word out to teachers and groups around the state. So I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next question. So in the movie, it talked about the fact that cleanups were great, but they were really just a way to figure out how bad the problem truly is. What are the most effective ways to turn off the tap when it comes to plastics?
That's a big question. You know, I think there's personal responsibility in your consumer choices. And really looking, you know, I think one of the best activities people can do is a waste audit, is literally keeping all your stuff for a month and seeing what it is and what you can eliminate. 9 times out of 10, you can eliminate 50%. Just without actually being inconvenienced. You really understand how overpackaged our world is, and unnecessarily so. So, you know, that's sort of like the first step. But turning off the tap is, you know, as Jenna mentioned earlier, these are really entrenched systems, and they're intertwined with our political realities. So our idea is, if we keep elevating the voices of impacted frontline and fence line communities about, you know, what their lived experience is living around a place where this stuff is being refined, that we can actually make a dent and push back on turning off the tap. We also need wide-scale investment in alternative delivery systems and reuse schemes. So when I say alternative delivery systems, like, we want the product, we don't necessarily want the package that comes with it. I think one of the most effective, like, organized tactics we've seen is brand shaming. So one of the things we did as a movement, the Break Free from Plastic movement, recognizing that a lot of our members were engaged in cleanups, is let's add another layer to it, and let's start recording which brands we're finding. And then we publish that data, and we had never seen that big and that quick a response from industry. So one of the ways that industry is most vulnerable is from a PR standpoint. They do not, like Coca-Cola does not like pictures of their bottles near a bird's nest or in the environment or littered, because that is their sort of brand equity, as it were. And they're super conscious about that. So the more we demonstrate visually brands polluting the environment, the faster you're going to get responses from CEOs. And part of it is too, like in policy, the job of the grassroots is to demonstrate there's enough citizen will for a politician to have political cover to vote on a policy. That's the way it's supposed to work anyway. And if we create that same amount of visual evidence and target it at a brand owner or, you know, one of these big brands, we can actually move the needle. Because the problem with publicly traded corporations is a CEO, she only can make decisions based on raising capital for her shareholders, like by law, like she has a fiduciary obligation. The more that we can demonstrate that plastics and packaging are brand liability, she can then make fiduciary or money decisions based on that threat to the brand. So we just got to give the political cover and the capitalist cover for those to make those decisions made.
I think that's a good point. The other side of it to remember is like that example you're making about that brand identity where Coca-Cola doesn't want their trash out in the environment getting photographed because, I mean, it's trashy. Littering is bad. Their product being out there, I mean, it's not a good image, but at that point, it's like cost and worth, right? Their image is worth more than, and putting that marketing out there, than it is to actually admit there's a problem, we're responsible. It's not up to the consumers to bear the burden of what to do about it. We need to be held responsible. It's the same thing as, you know, knowingly polluting someone's water. I could not walk up to a committee and pour glasses of water with knowingly polluting them and not be convicted of whatever crime. I mean, there's such a difference where corporations are not held accountable to the same expectations that we as citizens are. And more often than not, we are held to an even higher standard by being the ones who the burden falls on. Well, there's not a need for regulation. There's not a need to ban it. It's a consumer education thing. Whereas we all know that's obviously incredibly false.
Great.
But they do a good job of communicating that. It's very believable.
Thanks, Jenna. If anybody has a question, go ahead and raise your hand or type it into the chat box. We've got time for just one or two more. So I'm going to go ahead and ask if you can share a success story, something to inspire us.
Yeah, I can start from a global perspective, and I think Jenna can hit it home with some pretty great policy victories. And, you know, when we talk about plastic, let's remember, I just like to say plastic is frozen chemicals. So a chemical victory, an oil and gas victory, a plastic victory, they're all a victory against the same villain. So just remember, these things are all connected. I think one of, there's a couple inspiring solution stories. In Manila, Philippines, we demonstrated this decentralized waste management system. And we didn't have enough time in the film to go really deep into it, but, you know, in developing world countries where plastics industry is aggressively opening markets, they're bringing products in that the culture has never used, so they didn't develop infrastructure to handle it. And so a grassroots group of folks in a small village in Manila figured out that, you know, one of the first big problems is there isn't door-to-door collection because historically it wasn't needed. Food, leftover food was either composted, fed to animals. Paper and glass and metal had markets for recycling. And so those would make it to a recycler. But it's these residual plastics that have no value that became the big problem. So they were like, you know, we don't have people collecting our waste door to door. So one, we need that. Two, we're paying this incredible amount of money for all this mixed waste to go to a landfill, like 10 trucks a day from one village. And they're like, if we collect this stuff, and do it for free, but we require the residents to source segregate their materials so that, you know, paper never touches metal, never touches food, never touches glass, 4 different bins. All of a sudden the value of them as recyclables goes way up because one, you don't need to pay to sort it. And two, it's not contaminated with other materials or food or burrito grease or whatever. So they were able to cut down on the amount of trucks going to landfill by 90%. So 1 a day instead of 10. And by the way, they now created the infrastructure for door-to-door collection, which means there is no litter problem anymore. And before, you know, we look at littering as bad in this country, and it is. But if there's no can to put it in, you can't really call it littering. You know, if a company is opening a market in a place that there's nowhere for it to go, it's either going to be burned or it's going to go into the environment. And you can't put that on, you know, the fault of someone consuming that product. So these kind of systems are massive, and you know, they're pro-democracy, they're pro-women, they are pro-equity. They bring what waste pickers, who are often seen as scavengers or the lowest class in society, turn them into civil service and with, you know, well-paid jobs, and they're incentivized by being able to keep the money that they sell the products for recycling. So they get a wage plus they sell all the recyclables. So, and the cost of doing this at scale in the country of the Philippines is about $80 million, which is literally nothing for 200 million people. And so this model is scaling throughout Indonesia, in India, parts of China, and it's huge. You know, the other one I would say is, like, there's this woman named Destiny Wofford in Baltimore, Maryland, and she's a young woman of color, high school kid, you know, moving into college, who an incinerator was going to be sited right near her community. She started a grassroots effort, and like in one of the most poetic David and Goliath stories you've ever heard, she was able to organize an entire community of marginalized people to fight back on this incinerator, and won. And she won a Goldman Prize for it, which was Goldman Prize, for those of you who don't know, is like the Oscars of environmental activism. And the Goldman family gives a massive prize for excellence in grassroots organizing to 5 people every year. And she, you know, she got $150,000 and started an organization and has now become a symbol. So there are success stories out there, and I could keep going on, but you know, I'll throw it over to Jenna from a Minnesota perspective.
Oh my goodness. Well, let me list all of our victories. I mean, we could, but honestly, I think that that story you just told was a really great example. Whether you actually pass you know, the first of its kind restrictions in the country, or you're passing funding for a small subset of a community to fix, I don't know, maybe like an infrastructure problem or lead remediation. It's all important. And if you can circumvent a legislature that is so staunchly, extremely partisan that it's either going to pass unanimously or not at all because no one wants to take a stand. If you can get legislators on the record genuinely caring about an issue, whether it passes or not, I think that that has a lot of worth. I think that encouraging the next generation of environmental advocates to go out there and do things like the high school student you mentioned, despite the like looming like dread, the farther you get into it, the more you learn, the more hopeless you think it is. I think that people that genuinely care enough to persevere through that and coordinate with others and partner with other people who have similar experiences or who care about the same thing or who are also angry about the status quo and how hard it's been to even make incremental change. I think that that is powerful because when you look at the bottom line, anytime we're in these committees testifying, hoping that we have the votes to get out of committee, you know, you sit there and kind of cringe through the opposition testimony. The ACC can get up there and say whatever they want. But the reality is, I mean, the opponents of these protections have a vested interest in keeping business to continue as usual. And the proponents genuinely have nothing to gain aside from contributing to our community quality of life. And so I think if we even have a sign that that's happening and growing, that's good enough for me today.
So we've got just a few minutes left. I wanted to make sure that we gave each of you a chance to just kind of give us a minute of anything that you wanted to make sure we knew that hadn't come up through question and answer. So maybe Jenna, do you want to go first? And if there's anything you wanted to wrap up or make sure we hear, this is your chance.
Oh my goodness. I don't really have any closing remarks. I just really want to thank Stiv for always being willing to come through and chat with us and honestly really just creating a wonderful film that really provides a lot of great information that has been hidden for way too long.
Thank you. Stiv, did you want to have any closing comments?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to thank you all for taking the 90 minutes and then the hour afterwards to ask some really great questions and sort of think about this issue, you know, from a systemic standpoint. And just remember that, you know, for all the moments that we're overwhelmed or feel hopeless, there's a massive group of people rising up, you know, to tackle this issue. And they're doing it in solidarity and they're doing it intersectionally. And so I do feel that we are building power and momentum. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But, you know, when we talk about sustainability, it's become this sort of buzzword. But this disposable culture is unsustainable. And I don't mean it from a buzzword standpoint. I mean, it literally cannot be sustained. There isn't enough oil and gas. There's not enough landfill space. People like to fish, swim, recreate in water. We can't trash all the water. So it is coming to a head, and it will come to a head. And we are going to have to create a different future by necessity and from a survival standpoint. So hopefully we don't have to endure a lot of hardship before we usher in that new era. And I look at this pandemic, it's crazy to me that our film is getting wide-scale distribution, you know, during a time. But much of what the film is about is pointing to a different future. And we have a remarkable opportunity right now to reset, redeploy, and reinvigorate a movement of people to create not just the future we don't want, and not just talk about the future we don't want, but to actively participate in creating the future we do. And, you know, Milton Friedman, who I'm not a fan of, who sort of gave us trickle-down economics, is, you know, said that, you know, in the times of crisis, what was impossible becomes possible. And I agree with him 100%. Naomi Klein quotes him, disagrees with everything he said after that. But ultimately, you know, it's true. We can come forward with a very ambitious agenda and say, we are vulnerable if we are on oil and gas. We are vulnerable if we're on single-use plastic. So take this as a moment to reset, rethink, and reinvigorate this movement, and let's come out of it, you know, swinging.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I want to do a special thank you to our speakers, Stiv Wilson and Jenna Grove. Their bios are in the chat. If you didn't get a chance to read them, please do. I want to thank the Story of Stuff who put together this movie. I want to thank everybody who was involved with the Story of Plastic, and the Picture Motion company who made it possible for us to show it. And I just want to close with some thoughts that organizations like Clean Water Action don't expect everybody to be experts on single-use disposable plastic pollution, but you can sign up to become a member and donate, or just sign up to get action alerts and we'll let you know when it's time to call your representatives, when it's time to take a vote, or to take a local action to reduce pollution. There's a lot of things that you can do. You can vote, you can support our local, state, and national initiatives, and you can take actions at home that will reduce your use of single-use plastics and reduce that demand. And in fact, Tom put in the chat box a link to our website, www.cleanwater.org/MN for Minnesota. And at the top of our homepage right now is a pledge that you can sign up for to pledge to reduce your use of single-use plastics. Take a minute, sign up, and we'll get in touch with you to help remind you and help give you tools that you can use to make your own actions at home more sustainable. But there's so much we can all do, but we can only win if we all put our minds to it and put our hearts to it and work together for change. So thank you again to everyone who participated. Thank you so much, Stiv and Jenna. Thank you, Tom, for all of the back work. And thank you all so much for being part of a group of people that cares about this issue. Sign up today and we'll get you hooked up. Thanks so much and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, guys.